Give us your sense, because you are a student of this, you've followed it. How do we measure how bad it is and what got us here?
Well, I mean, I think there are lots of people measuring how bad it is. And I think we've seen a million studies and a million pieces of evidence. But in terms of the felt experience, the lived experience of people, all we have to do is look at how incredibly deeply the effects of this virus have been divided racially and economically. So how did we get here is another whole question. I mean, I think what we're learning from this conversation about systemic racism is that you don't need an individual racist in a system for a system to be racist. It's about outcomes. And so whether or not individual people inside of our economic structures intended for this to happen or not, 50 years of changing American economic policy and social policy to eliminate the power of unions to negotiate better on behalf of their laborers, tax policy that has just consistently been rewarding wealth and punishing work, and then a corporate ethos, which has privileged the shareholder over every other interest inside of the company. All of these things have come together in a kind of a perfect storm that has just driven wealth all the way. It's like money has been driven uphill and is being held there by unnatural forces.
Yeah, as I said and you say, this has been building for quite some time. This is not an overnight phenomenon at all. By the way, under Democrat as well as Republican presidents, I should say. Basically, Washington has allowed this to develop. Let's talk about tax policy specifically. What should we do with tax policy right now? Is it a matter of increasing corporate income tax? Is it a matter of increasing income tax on the wealthy? Is it inheritance tax? Is it wealth tax? What's the best way to address this problem?
I mean, sadly, I'm more of a shotgun approach than a single silver bullet, because it's been the shotgun approach that has gotten us to this point. So, Republicans consistently and Democrats less consistently have pushed the idea that government is bad in every iteration, and that money always is best in the hands of private individuals. And at the abstract level, all of that is well and good, but we've starved state governments and city governments, and so and all of that creates a cycle where inequality worsens. So we need to, first of all, look at things, I think, philosophically. Like, do we honor work over ownership, or is ownership the more important role in an economic system? I happen to believe work is something that needs to be honored more. So if you take that philosophical viewpoint and you look at our tax structure, and then you see that, for instance, the capital gains are taxed more favorably, and that income can be viewed as a capital gain, say if you're in private equity or in hedge fund investing. So the carried interest loophole I would go after first, right out of the gate, partly because of the money that it would generate, which is actually not enough to fix the problems we're in, but it's certainly enough to send the message that the work of people should be taxed favorably, because work is what makes markets work. Sorry, I got lost in that sentence. I would go after the inheritance tax, which has been called the death tax for years. It is not. It's a tax on an inheritance and not on the estate. So we need to be looking at that as a tax that I receive as a person who inherits money, that I pay for and I'm responsible for because of the privilege I have of being able to have money passed to me by my grandfather, whose work and accumulation of capital was supported by the state in more ways than we can count. We need a wealth tax. I frankly believe Elizabeth Warren is completely right about that. I think it is very easy to talk about a 1% or a 2% wealth tax that would generate so much value in this economy, given how much wealth is concentrated, and is sitting there not moving through the economy in ways that it really should, and certainly not supporting a valuing of work over ownership. So if we could move some of those assets that are just sitting there like stones in a mountain back into circulation in the economy, we would have money to fund schools. We would have money to fund all of the things that we have let erode over these last 50 years.
Abigail, one would say that if you go back to the Gilded Age, it took a fairly wealthy person who was part of the establishment to turn things around. Teddy Roosevelt in reform in the late 19th century, early 20th century. What's it going to take this time? Is it going to require some of the wealthiest among us to really step up and make a change? Because it is a systemic problem, as you suggest.
Right. Right. It is going to require wealthy people to change the way they understand their relationship to the rest of the country. Because right now, everything that wealthy people do only reinforces them in this idea that they're separate and different and that their fates are not woven together with the fates of people across the rest of the economy. So the private rooms and the private planes, the private lessons and all the private schools, all of this is reinforcing of a set of assumptions about how different the rich are and special and entitled. So we are going to have to teach our wealthy people to be different. We are going to have to show them all that they benefit. And we're going to have to talk about this sort of radical idea that there is such a thing as too much money. There is such a thing as too much money. And like, if we could get our wealthy class, they're always going to be bad actors, but for the most part, most people mean well, and most people want to be good people. And I think that overcoming of this idea that what you do and what you have has nothing to do with everybody else, if we could overcome that misconception, I think that wealthy people would be very supportive of behaving differently as citizens in a bigger society.
Abigail, what's gone wrong with the political system? Because I've looked at the numbers, and it's the 99% who are being disadvantaged by the 1%. That 99% could outvote the 1%. Why doesn't that happen? The theory in this country was once we gave everybody the vote, it would correct itself. That didn't happen. Why?
Yeah. Well, I got to say that, we cannot underestimate the importance of Citizens United. But Citizens United happened as the result of a long 50-year commitment of the wealthy and moneyed interests in this country to changing the structure of how things were happening. So we have come, we've always had a winner-take-all system, but it didn't always quite yield the kind of narrow and specific interests, the results for those interests as it is right now. So, 50 years ago, Milton Friedman, we all know, came out with an article in the New York Times and began to popularize the idea that only shareholders matter. So that was the beginning of a corporate mindset that resulted in the Gordon Gekko greed is good sort of way of operating. And I've had hedge fund managers tell me that they were there on Wall Street when he said that. And he said it was like, one of my friends said, it was like an animal was unleashed. So that was happening. But we forget that at the same time that was happening, there was something called the Powell Memo, where the Chamber of Commerce asked Lewis Powell, who eventually becomes Supreme Court Justice, to write a memo on how he would change America to become a more pro-business culture. And the two things really dovetail in a way that's incredibly important, because Milton Friedman said free markets work for everybody best as long as you're playing by the rules. Lewis Powell said the free markets are not working for us because the rules are bad. Right. So at the same time as corporations were shifting the way they operated and their emphasis on shareholders, following what Milton Friedman had to say, they were also investing very heavily in rolling back regulations, in changing tax structures, in privileging corporations, and in moving corporate interests into the center of legal thinking, jurisprudence, and legislation. So between these two things operating together for 50 years, that's how you get a Citizens United. I would love to rest all of this problem on the one decision, but it took a lot of work to get to that decision.